Hello, friends. Welcome to another edition of Big Al's Rockin' Podcast. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't done so already, please like, subscribe, and share this episode. And this week I have Derek Shulman on the show, and he has a book called Giant Steps: My Improbable Journey from Stage Lights to Executive Heights. How are you doing today, Derek?
I'm doing comparatively well, except I've got a cold, but that's New York, and what can I tell you? But I'm doing quite apart from that.
Right on. Well, like I said, you've got this book. It's coming out in October. Is that correct?
October 7th, correct. Yeah.
October 7th. Just give us a brief overview about the book.
Well, the overview is basically my life from the when I was from conception in Glasgow, Scotland, where I was born, to where I am now, which is in Manhattan in New York City, and it's basically about music and my life in music, effectively, from either being a musician for about 15 to 17 years to being on the other side of the fence as an executive and just being involved in music my whole life, effectively.
Right. So when you started out, even before you started out, I have a quote here that it begins with a young Derek confidently telling his school teacher that he would grow up to be a star. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I was lucky enough when I was a kid or 11 years old or 12 years old to get a scholarship to what they call a grammar school in England, where the teachers wore mortarboards, literally, and cloaks, and it was all boys, and you were streamed in those days to be the elite. It was the upper class and lower class in those days, in the 50s and early 60s. And I got a scholarship, thankfully, and when I was about 14, the kids in the school were asked by the job master, what were you going to do? What was going to be your main study when you get older? And most of the kids in my class would either be professionals or scientists or doctors or businessmen or whatever they'd say that. And they picked on me, Mr. Rogers, and said, Shulman, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to be a rock star. And of course, all the class, cracked up, this teacher said, "Don't be silly, Shulman. That will never happen. You have 1 in a million chance, and you're not one." And I said, "Well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be a pop star." And that was when I was about 14 and a half, 15. And literally within about, I think when I was leaving school, about when I was about 16 and a half or 17, I came back and I was, leaving school at that point, and I'd had a single out, and I signed to my autograph for the first single to that very same teacher.
What was his reaction to you getting to sign the single?
It was saying, well, his reaction, and I think everyone else's reaction was, good for you. I mean, because he said that'll never happen. Well, it did. And I think that everyone supported me, but when I said it, I wasn't supposed to do that because I was streaming into this profession, the upper class of the British society, and of course, I was never part of that. I was always the I was always the lower, the working class kid who hopefully made it better than most of the other kids did. Excuse me.
So, the single that you put out, it was with the 1960s pop and R&B group Simon Dupree and the Big Sound. Is that correct?
That's correct. Absolutely correct. Yeah.
So, how did you get that band started, and how did you guys manage to find fame in Europe?
Well, I started out basically with my school friends. I mean, in those days, in the mid to late 60s, uh, England was England was an amazing place. It was full of creativity. The Beatles came out, and they changed everything, of course. And everyone, especially everyone who loved music, were listening to the radio, and I, in particular, was very interested because my house was full of music. My father was a professional musician. I had musicians and music all around the house, all day, all night. And so, I decided when I said to the jobs master, I'm going to be a pop star, to put together a group of friends from school with my brother Ray, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. And I started a group, and playing R&B music and blues because I was listening to American Forces music from Germany because that was something that all the British kids who were into music did. We listened to black music, the Chess records and all these other Howlin' Wolf and Little Sonny Boy Williamson and Motown and soul because they were broadcast from Germany from the American Forces Network, and we listened to it and we said we're going to do that. So my first group started playing that kind of music, and so we got better basically. And my brother-in-law, who was a BBC producer, took on the management role and said, you know what, you guys are pretty good because we got a very good following in England and in Europe. And he said, I'm going to get you a, a, uh, uh, a showcase at EMI Records. So we went up to EMI. We did our full set in front of the whole staff there, including George Martin, Jeff Emmerich, Alan Parsons, etc. We came back from London, where Abbey Road is, of course, and we came back to Portsmouth, where we lived. And 2 weeks later, we found out we had a record deal. So our first record came out, and it nudged the top 40. So we were a recording band called Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, and that from there on we got better and better, and we had a very big hit in 1967 called Kites, and and then we gradually became very very popular all over Europe.
So in the 1970s, you go from an R&B group called Simon Dupree and the Big Sound to a progressive rock pioneer group called Gentle Giant. What what was the motivation behind completely switching gears and changing genres?
Well, we were getting better better musically, and we were also, getting frustrated at playing the pop hits to an audience that just wanted to hear the hits and not something a little new. So, and at that time, in the late 60s and early 70s, all the bands that were around during that period, there were bands all over Britain that were making noise. There was a band called the League of Gentlemen that lived near where we were. They changed their name to King Crimson. There was a band called the Idol Race, which changed their name to ELO. There was a band called Band of Joy that changed the name to Led Zeppelin during a period. Everyone was changing their sound because England was thriving. In Carnaby Street, the 60s, everything was, and we were getting better. So we decided that we were stuck with this pop, um, I guess, pop record thing around our necks. And we said, enough. And actually, one of the people that was almost like, how can I put this, a conduit for us was our interim keyboard, a guy called Reg Dwight, who changed his name in 1970 to Elton John, and he was our keyboardist. And he said, "You guys are really great. This is me and my brothers. You should think about listening to other bands like Spirit and Frank Zappa." And in fact, a year and a half after, that was what we did, and we asked them. That's when we decided to change, stop our group, Simon Dupree, and literally change what we did and stop everything and revamp what we were going to do. And in fact, we called Reg at that time and he said, "We're going to do what you said we're going to do. Would you like to think about being part of the group?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to be part of the group." So we went up to a place called in north of London, and Reg had Bernie there Bernie had just met him, and he started playing songs like Skyline Pigeon and all that kind of stuff. And myself and my brother Ray, um, yeah, we listened to him, but we thought going back on the train, this wasn't going to be for us. And he said at that same time, I'm changing my name to Elton John. And yeah, we said okay, but yeah, we didn't mention anything to him just then. But of course, we thought that's not going to work. Of course, the year later, he became Elton John and became a massive star, and then we became Gentle Giant. We're scrambling for gigs. So thank goodness he didn't join the band.
It's funny the way the music industry is so intertwined, but most of us don't know these nice little stories until decades afterward.
Yeah, there are so many stories that yeah, that aren't in the book that I still, there's so many little vignettes that you remember afterwards that, boy, that would have been a nice thing to put in the book. But yeah, these things are, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, that's down. Sorry. Yeah, the art in the book that yeah, that everyone. But the thing is, everyone knew each other in those days. Every band, especially bands that were signed to EMI, because you'd have 3 hours in the studio, and then after the studio, you go down to they had a little canteen. So you get to know all the groups that had just had a session. There's Pink Floyd, there's Cliff Richard, there's there's the LSO, London Symphony Orchestra. We're all hanging out in the canteen afterwards. So you got to know everyone, which is a fantastic thing to have experienced effectively.
I also read that Gentle Giant became a defining influence on hip hop, and some of the artists included Jay Dilla, De La Soul, Run the Jewels, and Travis Scott. What
Yeah.
was it like to be that kind of influence on a genre of music that you may not necessarily, uh, I don't want to say appreciate because that's not the right word, but you may not necessarily listen to on a regular basis?
Well, I'm very honored actually to say the truth because I think some of the better hip hop music is probably the most progressive music out there because they do things with sounds and they turn things around that is quite interesting. And in fact, I think if there's any kind of music which I'm more interested in these at this day and age, it's probably hip hop because there's a really interesting invention with their moving around with samples, of course, but nevertheless, it's interesting, and they do things which I would never think of doing. And in fact, Travis Scott this year and last year started off his last album with one of our songs called Proclamation, and opened the show with that, and it was just funny. I went to see a couple of shows, and it was just really funny and fantastic to see young kids singing along with Gentle Giant, and they had no clue what they were singing along with. So it was a fantastic feeling, to be honest with you.
That is awesome. So, moving to the 1980s, you decided to stop being on the stage and start being in the executive role in the music labels. And you've worked with Polygram, Atco, and Roadrunner Records. What motivated you to switch from the stage to the executive side?
Well, it was when we stopped the band. I didn't have a plan A or plan B. We just said, look, it's time to stop, because ideas were drying up, and it was a good time to stop. And I got a call from a friend that I knew from England who got a job in America for Polygram Records, and he called me and said, "Have you thought about, being in a record company?" My first answer was no. That's I wouldn't say they're the enemy, but they certainly were. That was the dark side, if you like. However, he said, "Look, we're putting together this department called the Rock Department at Polygram, and the head of the department would like to speak to you." And so I said, "You know what?" My wife said, "Hey, listen, I was living in LA at the time. Go out and find out what this is." So I went out to New York where I live now, and met with him, and in fact got offered the job to be both a promotion man and a artist development, which morphed into A&R. And I got the job. And I remember the first day I was there, and I had a little tiny office, and I went around to each office, and realized that every office was their own record company. Everyone in the office, one office, had their priority. And you go to the next office, and I speak to them and say, well, we don't like this band, but we like this band. And I realized that this music business that we were in as a musician wasn't really the music business. It was the business of music and how much priority you were given by the record company. And that first day, I remember going to this apartment where I rented and calling my wife and said, "I'm quitting today. I'm going home." And she said, "No, no, no, stay around. It's okay. You'll find out how it is." I did stay around and managed to understand what it was, and I became an A&R guy. And thankfully, I was very lucky and had enough, I guess, knowledge to have had a good success at Polygram Records. I signed some very pretty big acts, and thankfully did very well.
Very good. Besides understanding that the music business is really the business of music, was there anything you found surprising once you began working as an executive?
Um, yeah, of course, it was. It wasn't most of the people I worked with at that point were like music, but for the most part, a lot of people in that music business were in it for the perks and in it for the the lifestyle and also the lifestyle of other things, whether they were chemical romances or other romances of other kinds. Uh, which I'll leave just there. And that kind of disappointed me, to be honest with you. I was never into that in a group, and so I was never part of that scene. And so I was kind of a loner in whatever job I was in, whether I was working for Polygram until I became the president of a couple of companies. So I was never tempted to do any drugs or get involved with, women which of ill repute, if you like, etc. So, but what was important to me was that any band that I've signed and got involved with were authentic. They were the real thing. They weren't bands that followed other bands. They were bands that were leaders in their world, whether it was Pantera, whether it was Cinderella, whether it was Bon Jovi, whether it was Dream Theater, Slipknot, whatever it was. They were leaders and pioneers and not followers. And that was the key to these bands that I think, having looked back in my life, if you like, and Gentle Giant, and me talking about the music, that's something that we were as well. We didn't follow anyone. We just did what we wanted to do for whoever wanted to hear it.
Excellent. I know you listed a bunch of US bands there. Did you ever get to work with any UK bands?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, well, back in Simon Dupree, we that was all we worked with. We worked with everyone, whether it was Zeppelin or Cream or
Well,
you
let me I'm speaking as a record
know,
executive in the 80s.
with UK bands. Yeah, of course. Because at Polygram, um, we had a company in the UK and Europe, and a couple of bands were signed that I sort of championed. I didn't sign them per se, but I was part of being the group to promote Tears of Fears, for instance. Dexys Midnight Runners. Kevin Rowland would come over to my house. Um, yeah, bands that Def Leppard, of course. Yeah, so yeah, I was involved with a lot of bands at Polygram. At Atco, not as many. Uh, I think I was more focused on the American bands. At Roadrunner, we had some European bands, but really it was more American. But certainly at Polygram, that was one where I was very involved with bands that were signed to the UK company. I
What?
mentioned
Go ahead.
No, I mentioned a couple. Tears Affairs was one. And I loved their, their hurting and their follow up, and thankfully they were very successful. And again, some of these bands, Bananarama, etc. All these bands that were signed in England that we helped break in America.
What difference did you see working with US bands and UK bands?
Well, there was an experience that I mentioned in the book, excuse me, where the head of our department, Jerry Jaffe, absolutely loved a band called The Jam. And they were huge in England. And he wanted to break them so badly in America. And I had to work with them in America. And they didn't really like to be in America, honestly. Their father was a manager, and they uh they 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 thought that touring America was basically 6 shows. You do one in New York, one in Chicago, one in LA, one in San Francisco, and maybe one in Atlanta. And that was the tour. Well, of course, having been in Gentle Giant, I said, no, you could do 6 shows in one town, and you haven't touched scrape the surface. So it was frustrating for them to be huge in England and even Europe, and not be at all popular in the US. And they were not pleasant enough. They weren't really pleasant because they were frustrated. They weren't pleasant to the record company or to me, But I could understand it because they were so big in England, but their music was so British that to try to convince radio that this music was huge in Europe was very, very difficult. So that was a difficult situation for the band and for me as well, which is a sad thing because they made some really good songs in UK, but they didn't really break here in America.
How did you do, excuse me, how did you approach artist development?
Well, artist development was easy for me because there's no band that could say you don't know what it's like to do this. I did. I knew what it was like to do everything. I knew what it was like to sleep on a bus. I knew what it was like to not have a bed at night. I knew what it was like to tour, nonstop for 3 months. I knew what it was like for the gear to break down because I was in 2 groups that did everything and did everything that any band that was I was signed that I signed or was going to sign do, and that gave me a very good legs up, if you like, to getting their trust and getting their not being knowledgeable about what it was to be on the road and being a rock star, if you like. I could literally pick up a guitar and say, no, try this chord. And they would listen to me because I knew that I had done that before.
That's a very unique and a very cool approach to be able to do that. Talk a little bit about how the music industry has evolved from the 60s to today.
Well, that's a good question. Um, well, there's no music business today. That's the thing. It's a very tough business to be in. And when I was starting, it was a free for all, and we were lucky in that we had people that believed in us as musicians, and what we did was learn how to play and learn how to be great on stage and learn how to get an audience to enjoy us and get that word of mouth out there. And little by little, we got our fan base, and we were able to make albums and become a band. In this day and age, with the advent of the internet. The internet's 20 years old now, but now it's about 5 seconds of TikTok, and the craziest thing for me is fame. Fame is the number one uh, the number one goal for a lot of musicians, a lot of artists on that I see and hear about. Fame and being in the public eye. When I was growing up, when I was a musician, and when I was in the business, it was about music. It was about really being a good musician. And if the money came along, that's even better. And if you became well known or famous, even better. But today it's almost 180 from there, where fame and money is the most important thing, and music has become probably the least important in in this music business, whatever that means anymore.
So, having said that, what advice do you have for up and coming artists today?
To do what I did and do something that is yours. Go out there and play and play and play and play. Get your audience. Yes, yes, you have a tool with the internet. Certainly that helps. But go and play in front of 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, 100 people. But get great and be your authentic. Be something that somebody else is not, because that's the only way you'll become well known. I won't say famous anymore, because the jigsaw puzzle to get to the top of the heap, it used to be 10 pieces. And then when I was running a company, it was 100 pieces. Now it's 10,000 pieces. But the way to make a living is to go out there and be really, really good at what you do, and don't be like anyone else. Do what you do and be yourself and be authentic. And that's it. End of story.
All right, well, tell folks how they can find this book.
Well, you could go on Amazon and see, pre-order on Giant Steps. You can go on gentlegiantband.com and find pre-order the book, or there's lots of places where you can see it, and it's I think it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting read. I hope it is, because it goes into me at the end talking about AI and how things could change, and using today's technology. But certainly go to Amazon.com and look at Giant Steps by Derek Shulman, and hopefully you'll enjoy it and understand what it was and what it was like to be a musician and in the music business in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and thousands. And here I am, still standing.
All right, well, Derek, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Big Al's Rockin' Podcast. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast outlet. Visit BigAlRocks.com to find past episodes, on-demand links to my radio show, links to my social media, and other Big Al shenanigans. Most importantly, please like and share this episode. Peace out.